Head of School, honored guests, I'm grateful for this invitation to give the immortal memory of Robert Burns. I speak now with some trepidation, for as will be clear from my accent, I am not from these parts. But this should only serve to remind us that Robert Burns is not only Scotland's national bard, but that he's revered around the world. Growing up in Chicago, I was aware of Burns and his poetry from an early age, and of course we read him in school. A dear family friend when I was growing up was John Craddock, born and raised in Ayrshire before emigrating to Chicago in the 1920s. An embodiment of all that is best in Scotland, John ensured I would venerate Burns. And around the world at this time there will be Burns suppers to celebrate the poems and songs of this Ayrshire ploughman, farmer, and exciseman. Many Burns suppers like ours have to be held online because of the pandemic, and what Burns would have thought of an online Burns supper is anyone's guess. The immortal memory is the serious part of our evening. It's when we take a little time to reflect on the more weighty aspects of his life and contributions. And as we are a school of divinity, it seems appropriate that I should especially reflect on his religious views. Much has been said over the years about his religion, not all of it very well informed. Some have portrayed him as fundamentally opposed to religion, and especially to the dominant Scottish Presbyterianism of his day. This is a misrepresentation. Religious faith and practice were extremely important to Burns, and he was steeped in the religious culture of Scotland, and especially Presbyterian Scotland. Robert Burns was born into a devout, though not entirely orthodox, Church of Scotland family. He was raised in Ayrshire, which had been described by John Knox as the receptacle of God's saints. This was also covenanting country, a region especially associated with 17th century Presbyterian resistance to monarchical absolutism and the arrogance of power. Burns grew up with stories of the Covenanters and the Covenanting martyrs. His mother's grandfather, a Covenanter, had been killed by dragoons at Aird's Moss in 1680. His father, William Burns, was from the northeast of Scotland and had worked on the draining of the Nor Loch in Edinburgh before settling in Ayrshire as a farmer. Described as, quote, fearless towards all that God has made, he shared the Scottish Presbyterian commitment to education and the idea of the democratic intellect. That is, the idea that talent would be found in all social orders, and that it should be nurtured for the good of the community. He devoted much of his meager income to educating his children, joining in the subscription for a tutor, the gifted John Murdoch, to set up a village school. And later, when Murdoch moved to teach at a school in Ayr, he paid to have Robert board with Murdoch. He also subscribed to a local lending library in the district to ensure his children had access to a variety of books. The Church of Scotland in Ayrshire was, when Burns was growing up in the 1760s and 1770s, deeply divided. On the one hand, there were the Calvinist Old Light Presbyterians, fervently committed to the orthodoxy of the Westminster Confession of Faith and the old religious ways. On the other hand, there were the more moderate New Light Presbyterians, who were embracing the new spirit of the Enlightenment, with its hopes for a new world emerging through knowledge and reason. Old Light Presbyterians held firmly to the old doctrines of human depravity, predestination, and eternal punishment in hell. New Light Presbyterians emphasized private judgment, individual conscience, practical morality, and belief in social improvement. Robert's father and Robert's pastors in his early years, William Dalrymple, William McGill, John McMath, were New Light Presbyterians. Robert embraced the New Light views. He was a voracious reader, remarkably well read in theology and moral philosophy. His reading included Old Light theological works such as Thomas Boston's Fourfold State, and it also included philosophical and theological works by John Locke, Francis Hutcheson, Thomas Reid, Adam Ferguson, and Adam Smith, authors who were favored by the New Light Presbyterians. Burns became a lively and informed conversationalist, able to hold his own in the most learned company. In 1786, shortly after the publication of his first volume of poems, Burns made his first trip to Edinburgh, then a major center of the European Enlightenment. And in Edinburgh he met and impressed the luminaries of the Scottish Enlightenment. Burns was a striking figure, nearly 6 feet in height, broad-shouldered, hard-handed, with black hair and black eyes. The novelist, Walter Scott, then 15 years old, was present at one of the cultivated Edinburgh dinner parties, and 50 years later he would vividly remember Burns' conversation, his formidable presence, and especially those flashing black eyes. William Robertson, minister of Greyfriars Church, Edinburgh, leading figure in the Church of Scotland, principal of Edinburgh University, and celebrated historian, found Robert Burns to be one of the most extraordinary men I ever met, and believed his remarkable conversation was superior even to his poetry. Burns was very much a figure of the Scottish Enlightenment. Burns was a regular churchgoer for most of his life. While he did not much like it, he submitted to church discipline twice over his extramarital affairs, sitting for his penance before the congregation on what he called the creepy stool. When once asked what building had most impressed him in Edinburgh, he replied immediately, St. Giles Cathedral. His correspondence reflected theological learning and belief in a benevolent God, a practical morality, an innate moral sense, a reasonable religion, and a providential ordering of the world. Along with other Enlightenment figures, Burns disliked superstition, religious fanaticism, cant, and hypocrisy. He's well known for verses that deflated the pretensions of high-flying Calvinists and old light preachers in Ayrshire. These poems included Holy Willie's Prayer, with its lambasting of a despicable individual, an actual bachelor elder in Mauchline Parish Church, who was convinced that he was one of God's elect, predestined from before all time to salvation by God's free grace, and therefore intended by God to be, quote, a burning and a shining light before the lesser mortals whom God hath left in night. Burns was also highly critical of a certain type of hellfire preaching, which aimed more at asserting the power and authority of the minister than at interpreting God's will. although Burns knew full well that such hellfire preaching was popular in Ayrshire. In his early poem, The Holy Fair, Burns had fun with the distinctive form of celebrating the Lord's Supper in early modern Scotland. A parish would celebrate communion normally once a year. Ministers from the surrounding parishes would be invited to assist, preaching in turn while the communicants were served the bread and wine in small groups. The preaching would often go on all day. People from the surrounding parishes would come to the communion celebration to hear the sermons and to socialize, often over a cask of ale. And while the ministers put on their best pulpit shows, young people would meet up and couples disappear into the surrounding fields and get up to no good. Burns had great fun with the Holy Fair. In his poem, he described in comic verse how the hellfire old light preachers would attract big crowds by scaring them half to death, while the new light preachers of morality and calm sentiment would send the crowds back to the ale cask. And one of the greatest of the hellfire preachers was Alexander Moody, minister of Riccarton outside Kilmarnock. His very face, Burns tells us, would have sent the devil himself fleeing back in fright to the safety of his hot home in hell. Now awe the congregation o'er is silent expectation, for Moody spiels the holy door with tidings of damnation. Should horny, as in ancient days, mang sons of God present him, the very sight of Moody's face to his own het hame had sent him with fright that day. While Burns could be scathing about cant and fanaticism, he respected a genuine religious faith of the heart, or what he called in one letter, the religion of the bosom. He wrote eloquently of real personal faith, compassion, and the God who knew and loved each individual, and whose love was prior to his judgment. Awareness of God's love and our own human limitations, Burns insisted, should hold us back from being too severe in judging others. For even the worst of people may have resisted the temptation to be still worse than they actually were. Who made the heart, 'tis he alone, decidedly can try us. He knows each chord, its various tone, each spring, its various bias. Then at the balance let's be mute. We never can adjust it. What's done we partly may compute, but know not what's resisted. There was also in Burns a deep love. There was also in Burns a deep love of God's majestic creation and a sense of our being part of nature. Some of his most tender, moving verses express a heartfelt attachment with the natural world. And who else has written with such compassion of a wee mousie's distress over the destruction of her winter home, her wee bit heap o' leaves and stipple made with mony a weary nibble, or of a suffering wounded hare, poor wanderer of the wood and field, shot by a careless hunter, crawling off to die beneath the sheltering rushes. And what of the larger Scottish Presbyterian social ethos? Burns, as I've been maintaining, was largely shaped by Scottish Presbyterianism. To be sure, he rejected aspects of Calvinism, including predestination and eternal punishment. But he was steeped in the Scottish Calvinist culture. He believed in the awesome power and majesty of God. He believed that each individual had eternal possibilities. He believed that all work, if it contributed to society and was honestly done, was of value in God's eyes. And he believed that we should fear God and none other. Historians have explored how Scottish Calvinism was linked through such authors as George Buchanan to the Renaissance civic tradition of republican virtue and responsible citizenship. This Calvinist civic tradition emphasized liberty under law and communal values, and it condemned the corrupting influences of power, wealth, and luxury. For many, this ethos had found expression, imperfect to be sure, in the Covenanters and their sacrifices, as Burns acknowledged in a short but poignant poem of the 1790s. The solemn league and covenant now brings a smile, now brings a tear. But sacred freedom too was theirs. If thou art a slave, indulge thy sneer. And this brings us to his great song of the 1790s. A man's a man for all that, with which I will close. Of Burns' 550 surviving poems, it is his songs that are best loved, especially this one. It is usually ascribed to the influence of the democratic ideals of the French Revolution, and there's much truth in this. But the song was also profoundly influenced by the Scottish Presbyterian ethos in which Burns had been raised, with its references to the dignity of honest labor, to the God-given common moral sense, to the value of each individual, even those wearing hodden gray and dining on humble fare, and to the corrupting effects of wealth and power. Above all, there's faith in an overriding providence, the awesome sovereignty of God, moving the world for all that is wrong and all the setbacks ever closer to that millennium of light and love which Burns knows is the divine will for humankind. Some may know the moving performance of the song, sung without accompaniment, by Sheena Wellington of Dundee at the opening of the Scottish Parliament in 1999, which took place in the Assembly Hall, part of our iconic New College buildings, whose 175th anniversary we celebrate this year. If you've not heard Sheena Wellington's performance, go to YouTube. As she came to this final stanza, the members of the Scottish Parliament joined in a shared celebration of faith and hope. Then let us pray that come it may, as come it will for all that sense and worth o'er all the earth shall bear the gree in all that. For all that and all that, it's coming yet for all that man to man the world o'er shall brothers be for all that. With these stirring words in support of democracy, human rights, and human dignity, never more important, never more pertinent than they are in the world today, may I ask you to be upstanding and to drink a toast to the immortal memory of Scotland's bard, Robert Burns. To Robert Burns.